everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing sensory and motor pathways. I brought out this drawing of the spinal cord that we did maybe back in chapter 11, and if you remember, we have sensory information coming in from the PNS to the CNS on the dorsal side. It's being brought in on this unipolar neuron, and we're going to synapse here on the posterior gray horn. And when we talked about this earlier, we talked about how the information goes up to the brain in an ascending tract. Remember, a tract is a bundle of axon in the CNS and goes to the thalamus and then goes to the somatosensory cortex. But we weren't very specific about exactly how that information got there or what kind of information was going. The first part of this video, we're going to be talking about the pathways of how different types of information get brought up to the cerebral cortex. In the second half of the video, we're going to talk about skeletal motor pathways. So we also talked about how the skeletal motor neurons are going to synapse here in the anterior gray horn, and these are multipolar neurons, and they're going to take out the instructions for skeletal muscle movement from there. Again, how does the information get to here to tell our
somatic motor neuron what to send out to the skeletal muscles?
We're going to go through all the pathways today. There are 4 sensory pathways we're going to discuss. The first one we have already talked about. This is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. The sensory information is going to come in from the periphery, and this is going to be information on touch, pressure, vibration, and some proprioception. And if you remember, the types of receptors that are responsible for this type of information is going to be those encapsulated receptors. So an encapsulated receptor is going to pick up these sensations. That information is going to be carried as an action potential on a neuron and come in on the dorsal side. And you can see what happens. There actually is no synapsing here. This same neuron is going to go through that posterior gray horn and into the posterior white column. It will then ascend up through the pons, do you remember the gracile fasciculus? And then to the medulla. Now this is all one neuron. So say you touch something with your hand. That neuron, the receptor that's in my fingertips, is the same neuron that is going all the way up to the medulla in my brainstem. That's called our first order neuron. A first order neuron is going to conduct impulses from the somatosensory receptors to the spinal cord or the brainstem. So here we go, all the way up to the brainstem. Now, in the medulla, we're going to synapse with another neuron. This is going to be a second order neuron, and a second order neuron is one that conducts impulses from the brainstem and spinal cord to the thalamus. So you can see that we're synapsing right here, and then the next thing that that neuron is going to do, it's actually going to cross over. So remember, we talked about crossing over in the medulla, and so this particular pathway is going to cross over and go to the other side of the spinal cord. The information's coming from the left side of the body, but it's actually going to go to the right side of the brain. So our second order neuron is going to come up to the thalamus, where all somatosensory information gets relayed, and we're going to synapse with our third order neuron. And a third order neuron is going to take sensory information from the thalamus to the appropriate place in the somatosensory cortex. So we have 1, 2, 3 neurons that are responsible for bringing in the information on touch, pressure, and vibration. So that's the posterior column medial lemniscus, and you can kind of remember the name because it does ascend in the posterior white column. And then remember, the medial lemniscus was that pathway from the medulla up to the thalamus where it crosses over. One thing I wanted to point out is that here on the lumbar spinal cord, you're going to be bringing in information from the lower limbs and the trunk. Information that's coming in on the cervical spinal cord, so much higher up, remember this is the lumbar region. On the cervical region, we're going to be bringing in information on the upper limbs, upper trunk, and the posterior head. So the same thing happens, it just doesn't have as far to go. You don't have as big of an ascending tract if you have information coming in from the upper part of the body. Okay, our next sensory pathway is called the anterolateral pathway. The anterolateral pathway is going to be bringing in information about the sensations of pain, temperature, itch, and tickle. So that information is going to come into the spinal cord, and here's our first order neuron. So if you're feeling pain, the information is going to come in, and that first order neuron is going to come in and synapse right there in the posterior gray horn. Our second order neuron is going to start right there in the spinal cord segment. So there isn't as much. So the first order neuron isn't as long as in the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. So the first order neurons are going to synapse with second order neurons, which are going to decussate right there. They're going to go through the gray commissure at that particular spinal segment. They're either going to ascend on the lateral or the anterior spinothalmic tract, go all the way up through the brainstem to the thalamus. There, they're going to synapse with a third order neuron, which will take the information on pain, temperature, itch, and tickle to the appropriate area of the somatosensory cortex. And if you remember from this drawing that the information of pain, temperature, tickle, and itch carried on neurons that have free nerve ending receptors. So the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway is going to use this type of neurons with this type of receptor, and the anterolateral pathway is going to be carrying this information on these types of neurons with this type of receptor. Notice that they're both unipolar neurons, and we're just getting more specific about which kind of receptor the unipolar neuron uses. Okay, so our next somatosensory pathway is called the trigeminothalmic pathway. So the trigeminothalmic pathway is going to be bringing in information from the face, the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, and the teeth. So again, sensory information pretty much from your face is going to be coming in on a unipolar neuron into the trigeminal nerve. So remember the trigeminal nerve, that's number 5, and carries a lot of information, pretty much all the sensory information from all of these very important places. So these sensations are going to come in on the trigeminal nerve. Now some of them are going to synapse right there at the pons. So the second order neuron is going to start here in the pons. Some of the impulses are actually going to go back down to the medulla, where they're going to synapse with the second order neuron and cross over. So some of the impulses will cross over in the pons, and some of them will cross over in the medulla. In any case, both of these tracks are going to ascend through the midbrain and up to the thalamus, where they're going to synapse with a third order neuron. The third order neuron will then take the impulses to the appropriate place in the somatosensory cortex. Now notice I didn't specify which type of information was going where, and that's because this pathway is going to carry pretty much all of the sensations. All of these are being carried through this pathway. So where is all this information going? Well, it's all going to the somatosensory cortex. That is shown here. This is a frontal section of the somatosensory area in the right cerebral hemisphere. And as you can see, all the different parts of your body have a little bit of real estate in that very little narrow gyrus, that is the somatosensory cortex. You can see that the face, lips, and hands have more real estate than anywhere else, and that's because we have more sensory information coming from the face, mouth, and hands than anywhere else in the body. So let's just draw like a little pretend thalamus down here. And one way to do a really good review of everything in this chapter is to imagine a sensation somewhere on your body. So say you put your hand down on the car motor and you can feel it vibrating. Okay, well, that's vibration. What kind of receptor detects vibration? The type of neuron that's going to pick up vibration is going to be an encapsulated neuron. So we have an encapsulated neuron picking up the sensation of vibration. Which pathway is vibration going to use? If we're talking about vibration, we're going to be talking about that posterior column medial lemniscus. Vibration. Using the posterior medial lemniscus column, coming up in a second order neuron, synapsing here in the thalamus with a third order neuron, and because it's coming from the hand, that information is going to be brought up to right about there. Say we have a different sensation. Say you have a hair on your cheek that's tickling your cheek. What kind of receptor picks up the sensation of tickle? Well, that would be a free nerve ending. So a receptor with a free nerve ending is going to bring the information about a tickle on your face. Which of the pathways deal with your face? That would be your trigeminothalmic pathway, which is going to bring in sensations from the face, oral cavity, nasal cavity, and teeth in on the trigeminal nerve, sensory neuron. Once there, it's going to come to the thalamus again, and our third order neuron is going to bring that information to the appropriate place so that your brain knows that it's a tickle sensation that's coming from this part of the body. How about if we have a pain in your foot? Pain is picked up by free nerve endings, receptors, carried on our unipolar neuron. Which pathway carries pain? Our anterolateral pathway. Pain will come up in an ascending tract to the thalamus, where it will be routed to the appropriate place. So the brain can tell what's happening and where based on which ascending pathway the sensations use and which part of the somatosensory cortex is activated. So let's talk about how the information gets from this primary motor cortex down. In order to do that, we have to talk about some terms. Let's draw out a very rough sketch of the central nervous system. Here's the brain, here's the spinal cord, here are your arms and legs. We have two types of neurons. Upper motor neurons are going to have their cell bodies up here in the cerebral cortex, and then they're going to descend down the cord. Lower motor neurons are going to have their cell bodies in either the brainstem or the spinal cord. If you're going to send out a motor plan, you're going to first activate an upper motor neuron, which will then synapse with a lower motor neuron somewhere, and then that information will go out to the PNS. We also have two different types of pathways. A direct motor pathway is what I've drawn here, where the input to the lower motor neuron is coming directly from the cerebral cortex. An indirect pathway is when the lower motor neuron receives its information from an area in the brainstem. So this is when the cerebellum gets involved. Okay, let's talk about the tracts. First tract, the lateral corticospinal pathway, very important. This is going to be giving information to your skeletal muscles on the distal limbs. When you're talking about your distal limbs, we're talking about the hands and fingers and feet and toes. So this tends to be fine, precise movements. So if you're playing the piano or buttoning your shirt or tying your shoe, the motor information to do that is going to be carried on this lateral corticospinal pathway. So you can see that we're initiating our motor plan here in the primary motor cortex. It's going to travel all the way down through the brainstem to the pyramids of decussation. That's where this neuron is going to cross over to the other side of the cord. So if we want to move our left hand, we're going to initiate the motor plan with the right side of the brain. It will decussate here in the medulla and continue down this lateral corticospinal tract, where it will then move into the anterior gray column and synapse with a motor neuron, which will take out that information to the appropriate skeletal muscles. So this one's kind of an easy one to remember. The anterior corticospinal pathway is just a little bit different. We're sending out a motor plan to move our skeletal muscles in the trunk and proximal limbs. In this case, again, we want to move the left side of the body, but this time I want to just move my arm around. And so I'm going to start on the right side of the brain in the primary motor cortex. That neuron is going to come all the way down, and we're not going to decussate here in the pyramids. We're going to keep on going down this anterior corticospinal tract, and then we're going to decussate at the very last moment. So we're going to decussate at the level of the spinal cord, synapse with a lower motor neuron, and that lower motor neuron is going to take out the information to contract your muscles to move your arm. So remember, when we were talking about the sensory pathways, we pretty much had 3 neurons. In these pathways, we only need 2 neurons to carry the information. Both the anterior and lateral corticospinal pathways are direct. We are taking our information directly from the cerebral cortex, and the upper motor neuron is synapsing directly with the lower motor neuron. So between these two pathways, the anterior and lateral corticospinal pathway, that's pretty much all the skeletal muscles of the body. However, we also have to be able to run the skeletal muscles of the head and the neck. And we're going to use the corticotubular pathway to do that. So on this drawing, we only have a few of the cranial nerves that carry motor impulses. Remember, there were 9 different cranial nerves that carry motor impulses. We have 2 of them here. So the information is going to come from the cerebral cortex. The upper motor neuron will continue through the midbrain and synapse with a lower motor neuron with the cranial nerve. So for example, if we're going to synapse with the facial nerve, we're carrying impulses for facial expression, whereas if we're going all the way down to the medulla and innervating the hypoglossal nerve, this is going to allow us to move the tongue. So these 3 motor pathways are all direct. We also have some indirect pathway. And remember, an indirect pathway is one in which the lower motor neuron is innervated from the motor centers that are in the brainstem as opposed to from the cerebral cortex. So these are the 4 indirect pathways.
These pathways target lower motor neurons in the spinal cord that are involved in reflexes, complex movements, and posture.
That's it for today. See you in class.